If you want reality to respond to you, you have to program your mind the way Carl Jung discovered. Not with affirmations, not with vision boards, not with positive thinking, with something far more precise, far more uncomfortable, and far more powerful than anything the self-help industry has ever sold you. Here is what most people do not understand. The reality you are experiencing right now is not random. Jung discovered that your internal psychological state and the events showing up in your external world are connected in a way that defies simple cause and effect. He called this synchronicity, not magic, not the law of attraction, something far more precise. When your inner world is unexamined, the outer world keeps presenting the exact situations and people that mirror your unresolved patterns. Not because you are creating them, but because your unintegrated psychology shapes what you notice and how you relate to everything around you. Have you ever felt like you are shouting into a void, but the world just keeps giving you the same old problems? The same type of people, the same frustrations, the same invisible wall you cannot seem to break through no matter how hard you try? That feeling is not bad luck. That is your unexamined inner world running the show, creating the conditions through which the same patterns keep finding you. Jung called this the psychological mirror, and once you understand how it works, you will never look at your external reality the same way again. He found something that most people spend their entire lives running from. There is a specific pattern buried inside your mind. And until you learn to examine it, the world will keep printing the same page over and over again. This is not a philosophy, it is a mechanism. And today, we are going to walk through exactly how it works, why it keeps failing most people, and the precise steps Jung outlined to reprogram it from the inside out. But before we get into the steps, understand something that nobody in the self-help space will tell you. The reason most people fail at changing their reality is not lack of effort. It is that they are fixing the wrong thing, renovating the house while the foundation is cracking. Jung figured out where the real problem lives, and that is where we are starting. Let us begin with what Jung actually discovered, because most people get this completely wrong. Jung spent decades observing patients who seemed stuck, not unintelligent, not lazy. Many of them were the most perceptive people in any room they walked into. They read others with startling accuracy. They sensed hidden tensions, spotted emotional patterns, and saw through social masks that fooled everyone else. Jung documented this in his clinical notes as differentiated perception. These individuals were not imagining things. They were genuinely processing reality at a deeper level than most people ever reach. But here is the paradox that consumed Jung. These same people, the ones who saw everything, were often the ones whose external lives were falling apart. Broken relationships, stalled careers, a persistent feeling of being trapped in a reality that did not match their inner world. So why was that? If they could see so clearly, why couldn't they change anything? Jung's answer would rewrite everything we think we know about perception and reality. He concluded that what you are capable of seeing in the external world is directly shaped by your internal state, not your intelligence, not your effort, the degree to which you know yourself. Think about that. You do not see reality as it is. You see reality as you are. Consider a composite profile based on observed psychological patterns. A highly perceptive individual, the type Jung would classify as an introverted intuitive, walks into every room and immediately senses the undercurrents. She knows who is lying. She feels the tension behind polite smiles. She detects hidden resentment beneath cheerful conversation. But despite this gift, her own life keeps recreating the same painful dynamics. The same people wound her. The same situations leave her feeling unseen. Jung's insight was precise. Her perception was not the problem. The problem was that her unexamined inner world kept drawing her toward the very patterns she most needed to understand within herself. Through the mechanism of synchronicity, Her internal psychology and her external circumstances were speaking the same language. The external world was not her enemy, it was her mirror. This is what Jung called the psychological mirror, and it leads us directly into the trap that destroys most people before they even realize it is there. The trap is called shadow projection, and it is the reason why most attempts to change reality fail before they even begin. Here is how it works. Every single one of us carries what Jung called a shadow. This is the collection of everything we have rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge about ourselves. The anger we decided was too dangerous to feel. The jealousy we were ashamed to admit. The fear we buried under layers of performance. The parts of ourselves that did not fit the image we were told we needed to be. Here is the brutal truth. Those parts do not disappear because you push them underground. They get projected outward. You start seeing them everywhere else. In your partner, in your co-worker, in strangers on the internet. The qualities you most despise in others are almost always the qualities you most refuse to see in yourself. Jung wrote about this pattern extensively across his clinical work. He observed patients who spent enormous energy fighting their external circumstances, battling the people who reflected their own denied qualities back at them, while the actual source of their reality remained completely untouched inside them. Picture a narrative illustration of this dynamic. Consider someone who cannot stand dishonest people. He prides himself on being a straight shooter. He argues. He confronts. He cuts people out repeatedly. And yet everywhere he goes, he keeps attracting dishonesty. The pattern never ends. Jung would tell you this. The war he is fighting out there is a war he refuses to fight inside himself, because somewhere in his own shadow lives a part of him that is also capable of deception, a part he has never acknowledged. And until he does, the mirror will keep showing him the same face. This is why fighting the mirror never works. You cannot change a reflection by attacking the glass. You have to change what is standing in front of it. But understanding this is only the beginning, because even when people intellectually accept this idea, they still get stuck. And the reason for that leads us to one of the most important concepts Jung ever identified, something he called Participation Mystique. Participation Mystique is the phenomenon where the boundary between the self and the world breaks down at a psychological level. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Jung borrowed this term from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe a primitive state of consciousness where there is no clear distinction between the subject and the object. The self and the world feel merged. Where one ends and the other begins becomes impossible to identify. For most people, this sounds abstract, but here is what it looks like in lived experience. Think about the last time you walked into a room where 2 people had just been arguing, even if they were now pretending everything was fine. You felt something immediately. But in Participation Mystique, you do not just feel it. You absorb it as if it were your own emotional state. You lose the boundary that tells you this feeling belongs to the room, not to you. That is not just sensitivity. That is ego boundary dissolution. Now scale that across every environment you move through, every day. That is the reality for people with differentiated perception. Their environments are not just around them, they are passing through them, and there is no psychological boundary to stop the flood. This is not a metaphor. It is a real psychological state, and it explains why even people who desperately want to change their lives keep getting pulled back into the same patterns. They are psychically anchored to a version of reality they never chose consciously. For the highly sensitive individual, the one with differentiated perception, this is especially dangerous, because they absorb not just obvious social signals, but the unconscious emotional atmosphere of everyone around them. Every unspoken tension, every suppressed feeling, every hidden agenda. It floods in constantly, until it becomes impossible to tell what belongs to you and what you have absorbed from the world. Jung called this the double-edged nature of the superior function. In his theory of psychological types, the superior function is your greatest strength, your most conscious, most developed tool. For the highly perceptive, intuitive type, it is the ability to sense patterns and read beneath the surface with startling accuracy. But here is where it breaks down. The superior function does not operate alone. It has a shadow counterpart that Jung called the inferior function. This is the least developed, most unconscious part of the personality. And when the superior function is overused, when perception runs constantly without rest or integration, the inferior function gets triggered. It floods the system. What was once your greatest strength starts generating overwhelm, emotional instability, and paralysis. Your gift has not disappeared, but it has been hijacked by the part of you that was never developed to handle the load. You see what others miss, but seeing is not enough, not even close. Jung's entire life work was about the next step, the step almost nobody takes. So let's talk about how you actually program the mind. Not theoretically, step by step. The first step is something Jung called identifying projections. It is the most important and most ignored practice in all of psychology, because it requires you to do the one thing the ego absolutely hates. Look at what irritates you in others and ask, with complete honesty, where does this live in me? This is not about blame. It is not about making you the villain of your own story. It is about reclaiming the energy you are spending on the mirror and redirecting it to the source. Here is a practical lens for this. Think about someone in your life who genuinely gets under your skin, not someone who has objectively harmed you, someone whose behavior creates a reaction in you that feels disproportionate. That disproportionate quality is the signal. It tells you the projection is active. Now ask yourself this: if this quality they have actually existed somewhere inside me, what would it look like? Where would it hide? Under what other name or disguise might I be expressing something similar? You do not need to answer perfectly. You just need to ask the question honestly, because the moment you ask it, you stop fighting the mirror. And that is when the reflection begins to shift. Here is what makes this counterintuitive. Most people expect the internal work to feel like weakness, like self-blame, like giving the other person a pass. It feels like none of those things. What it actually feels like is power. The moment you locate the projection inside yourself, you stop being at the mercy of whoever was triggering it. You take back the control you were outsourcing to them without realizing it. Jung observed this across dozens of case profiles. When patients stopped pouring energy into changing others and redirected it inward, something important shifted. Not the circumstances themselves, but their relationship to those circumstances. The psychological stamina to make different choices, hold firmer boundaries, and respond rather than react became available in a way it never had before. Different actions became possible. Different outcomes followed. Not because the world reorganized itself, but because the person finally had inner ground to stand on. The second step is what Jung called shadow integration, and this is where things get truly powerful. Shadow integration is not about becoming a darker person. It is about becoming a more complete one. Because right now, if you are like most people, you are running on half your power. The other half is locked away. All that anger you decided was too dangerous. All that ambition you called selfishness. All that strength you decided was too threatening. It is still there, generating pressure in your unconscious, leaking out in ways you cannot control because you have never consciously claimed it. Integration means going to meet those parts, not to unleash them recklessly, but to acknowledge them and put them under your conscious command, rather than leaving them to run wild underground. Let us look at a case profile that illustrates this transformation. Consider the pattern Jung documented again and again, a person who presents as gentle, accommodating, endlessly patient. Everyone takes advantage of them, treats their endless giving as a resource to be extracted. They have convinced themselves that softness is their identity. They have no awareness of the fierce, boundary-setting part of themselves because it was conditioned out of them early on. Then something happens. A betrayal too large to rationalize, a moment where the pattern becomes undeniable. If they are fortunate, they do not explode destructively. They integrate. They reclaim the strength they suppressed. And something shifts not just in how they behave, but in how the world treats them. Environments that once felt hostile begin to feel navigable. The person who once walked all over them senses something different and backs away. This is what Jung meant when he described the empath's shadow integration. It is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough. The kindness does not disappear. It gets structured by strength. And that combination creates a completely different signal. The world does not respond to who you wish you were. It responds to the totality of who you actually are, including the parts you have not yet claimed. The third step Jung outlined is what he called conscious sensitivity. And this is the step where the transformation becomes a permanent upgrade rather than a temporary shift. Most highly perceptive people experience their sensitivity as a liability. They feel too much. They absorb too much. They see dynamics that others deny, and they are blamed for naming them. Over time, they learn to distrust their own perception, to apologize for seeing clearly, to dim the signal that makes them extraordinary because the world around them cannot handle it. Jung's prescription was the opposite. Stop treating your perception as a problem to be managed. Start treating it as a precision instrument to be trained. The difference between suffering your sensitivity and wielding it comes down to one thing: discrimination. The psychological ability to know which signals belong to you, which you have absorbed from your environment, and what each type of signal is actually telling you. Jung taught his patients to practice what he called conscious discrimination. Daily solitude was essential, not passive rest, but active separation from absorbed content. The kind of quiet that lets the psychological waters settle, so you can see what is yours and what you have been carrying for someone else. When you learn to do this, something remarkable happens. The same sensitivity that once felt like being ambushed by reality begins to feel like early warning radar. You stop being the last person in any room to understand what is happening. You start being the person who sees 3 moves ahead because your nervous system has been processing the data all along. You just never learned to read it. This is the rebalancing Jung wrote about. When the superior function is no longer running unchecked, when the inferior function is no longer ambushing you from below, you stop being at war with your own psychology. You are not suppressing what you see, not being crushed by it. You are using it, consciously, strategically, with full awareness of where the information is coming from. The highly perceptive individual, once integrated, does not become less sensitive. They become selectively sensitive. They choose where their awareness flows. They choose what deserves their energy. And that choice is the most powerful program you can ever install in your mind. Jung observed this quality in patients who completed the full individuation cycle. Consider a composite profile based on these observed outcomes. Someone who once absorbed every room they walked into like a sponge begins to move through the world more like water, still fluid, still responsive, but no longer shapeless. They take the form they choose, not the form the container demands. They engage deeply when they decide to. They withdraw cleanly when that is the wiser move. There is a steadiness, an authority that was never there before, not because anything was added, because something was finally claimed. Now, let us talk about what happens if you do not do this work, because this is not theoretical, this is urgent. Jung spent years documenting what happens when perception goes unintegrated and the shadow continues to run unchecked. He had a precise term for the personal endpoint of that process. He called it possession, not in any supernatural sense. In a very specific psychological one, possession is what happens when an unconscious complex or archetype overwhelms the ego. The individual does not lose their mind in the dramatic sense. They lose their agency. The primitive, unintegrated part of the psyche takes the wheel, and the conscious self becomes a passenger in its own life. It is worth being precise here. Jung also used collective possession to describe mass psychological phenomena, entire populations swept up in psychic epidemics. But at the individual level, what concerns us is personal possession. The ego consumed by the very unconscious forces it refused to examine. Personal possession is what happens when your ego is overwhelmed by an unconscious complex you have never addressed. You stop being a person who chooses. You become a person who reacts compulsively to the script that complex is running. Your projections dictate your perception. Your absorbed material determines your responses. The mirror becomes your only reality, and you become a character in a story your own unconscious is writing without your consent. For the highly sensitive, highly perceptive individual, this process is particularly insidious, because it often does not look like a breakdown. It looks like exhaustion, a slow dimming, a retreat from the world that feels like wisdom, but is actually dissolution. You stop trusting your own perceptions because they have caused too much pain. You stop reaching for new experiences because the old ones keep playing on repeat. You become smaller inside a life that was always meant to be enormous. And here is the cruelest part. The people around such a person rarely notice it happening. They only notice the result. Someone who was once electric has gone quiet. Someone who once saw everything has started pretending they see nothing. The light does not go out dramatically. It slowly dims until the person themselves cannot remember what it felt like to be fully switched on. Jung called this one of the most common tragedies in his clinical work. Not dramatic collapse, quiet erasure. Jung documented a second form of this collapse he called the empath snapping. Not a quiet breakdown, a violent swing to the opposite extreme. The person who has suppressed their shadow for too long, absorbing everyone else's reality while neglecting their own, finally reaches a breaking point. And because the integration never happened consciously, when the shadow emerges, it comes without structure, without wisdom, without the ethical grounding that would have made it precise rather than destructive. The tragedy is not that it happens. The tragedy is that it was entirely preventable. The shadow was there the whole time, knocking, waiting to be invited in consciously, waiting to be integrated wisely, and when the door is never opened by choice, the shadow kicks it in. This is why Jung was so insistent. The individuation process is not a luxury for the spiritually curious. It is a psychological emergency for anyone who has been carrying the weight of unprocessed perception for years. But here is where the story turns, because once the program is updated, something almost impossible to explain begins to happen. Jung called it the turn towards self-knowledge. When projections are withdrawn and the shadow is integrated, the external world does not magically reorganize itself. What changes is your relationship to it. Your perception sharpens. The meaningful patterns Jung called synchronistic begin to register where chaos once seemed like the only option. You stop reacting from the unconscious and start responding from a place of genuine self-knowledge. And from that ground, the choices available to you are fundamentally different. This is not magical thinking. It is the psychological logic of integration. When you stop relating to your circumstances from a fragmented, unexamined inner world, you stop perpetuating the patterns that match that fragmentation. When you bring your shadow to consciousness, the people, opportunities, and possibilities you had always been too reactive or too depleted to reach become accessible. Not because the universe is rewarding you, because you have finally developed the psychological stamina to engage with reality as it actually is, rather than as your unexamined patterns insisted it must be. Consider the transformation profile Jung observed in patients who completed the individuation process. A composite picture emerges. Someone who once felt victimized by their own perception becomes extraordinarily capable of reading situations before others register them. Someone who once absorbed everyone else's reality becomes deeply boundaried about where their energy flows. Someone whose sensitivity once felt like a wound becomes the most strategically aware person in any room they enter. The external circumstances of their life do not just improve, they transform. Work built on the ability to genuinely read what people need. Relationships built on the ability to see through performance without fearing what is beneath. A life that feels authored rather than endured. This is what Jung meant when he said the individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but engages with it more consciously. The goal was never to see less. The goal was always to see more wisely. You were not designed to be overwhelmed by what you see. You were designed to use it. The reality you want is not somewhere out there waiting for you to deserve it. It is shaped by the degree to which you know yourself. And self-knowledge is not fixed. It is built, deliberately, consciously, on your terms. Jung spent his entire career proving that the most dangerous version of any human being is not the one who sees everything. It is the one who sees everything and never learns to do anything with it. The gift without integration is just pain with better resolution. The difference between the person destroyed by their perception and the person transformed by it is one thing only: the willingness to do the internal work, to identify what is being projected, to integrate what has been suppressed, to wield what was always meant to be a strength, not a wound. That is the path. That is the work. That is what Jung spent his life pointing toward. Now it is your turn to walk it. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.